Welcome to this online forum, How to Successfully Embed AI into Your IAPT Service, brought to you by SBK Healthcare and sponsored by WYSA. To find out more about further educational podcasts, webinars and forums, please do visit our website at sbk-healthcare.co.uk. This online forum follows the story of two unique services on their journey to embedding AI into their service. Hear from Dorset Healthcare NHS Foundation Trust and from IAPT Talking Therapies, Kensington and Chelsea, Central and North West London NHS Foundation Trust, in company with our chair, Ross O'Brien, the Managing Director of WYSA.
Hello, everybody. Thank you for coming in and joining us today. Our background in terms of WYSA is coming from the NHS. So we've got a lot of experience in terms of delivering digital therapeutics into IAPT services from within and in some of the regional and national support across the NHS. So it's lovely to have you all here today. What we're going to do is take you through the agenda, which should have been shared with you prior to the session, but we've got a couple of case studies to look at, and we've also got some information from WYSA about what we do in terms of AI mental health in IAPT services. What I'd like to do very quickly is just to kind of set the agenda for the day. Is to share my screen if I'm able to, and quickly talk you through some of the innovations that we've undertaken with WYSA in terms of AI mental health. So WYSA is the world's most advanced conversational AI for mental health. And we know that because we've got the first AI award with NIHR to look at embedding AI with a NHS service in mental health. And we're going to hear from Lucy and Alina today, who are going to talk about that. We've also got a really high Orca rating score. We've been the top rated app in Orca, the same in Google Play across all categories. And recently we were also awarded a best privacy with Mozilla. We take privacy and data security really importantly, and that's some of the success of WYSA. To give you an idea of what WYSA can do, we cover the whole sphere of wellness, primary care and secondary care and acute services in terms of our AI-based chatbot support. So most apps you will find operate in the kind of digital health apps operate in the wellness end of things. We, with AI, are able to safely and securely scale into the actual provision of therapies in primary care and secondary care services. But obviously today we're going to focus on our IAPT inputs. Just some information about the size of the company. The company is about 6 years old. We've got 4 million users internationally across 65 countries. So that shows you some of the scale that we've got in terms of people using the app. And we're working with a number of IAPT services in the NHS and some CAMS ones too. One of the things we're really proud of is the fact we've got an integration with Maiden or IAPTIS. We are the only organisation to have that in the UK, so it means we can onboard patients via our e-triage service. We're going to hear from Kelly and Morad from Dorset today about their experience of that and how it's worked. And then just to give you kind of an overview of the kind of holistic abilities of WYSA, we offer a complete end-to-end solution for digital IAPT therapies. So from e-triage and onboarding patients through to waitlist support, we're really proud of that. There's not another organisation that's able to support patients on waiting lists with the AI chatbot and with our self-help modules. Then, as patients come into therapy, we're opening up a suite of AI CCBT products so that patients can receive AI-supported CCBT as part of their kind of therapeutic intervention. And then finally, patients that are discharged, we keep the app open for them. So post-discharge, they're also able to get support throughout their care. So I'm just going to stop sharing because I believe that's my overview, but we've got a Slido to kind of set the scene today and to get some of your input into what you're kind of hoping to get out of today. Vanessa, would you be able to help to pop that Slido onto the screen for us? So if you're able, if you use, hopefully a lot of people during the pandemic have got used to Slido. If you're able to scan the QR code, or if you're able to follow the prompt there to slido.com, and excuse me, I've got a terrible cough today, so I'll probably cough a couple of times. But if you can go in and give us some feedback around what your challenges are in terms of delivering your service and where you think AI might help. Hopefully today we've had some feedback from your conversations in the breakout rooms as you've entered, but just to add a few thoughts in terms of where AI might be able to help would be brilliant. I like the way that the Slido enhances the words when people agree. And what's interesting is in terms of wait lists, that is what we hear back a lot. We'll be able to, you'll be able to hear from some of the presentations today about what happens for wait lists supported by AI therapies in the NHS. But also there's some stuff about access targets and being able to increase access. And answering queries and support are also some of the things that AI can help with. What I'm going to do is please keep those coming in the background. We'll review those later in the session. But it gives me a great pleasure to hand you over to Kelly and Morad from Dorset, and I will let them introduce themselves, and they're going to talk to you about how they've worked to improve client safety, engagement, and the quality of care using AI. So a real practical example of how it's been done.
Hello, so I'm Morad. I'll just check that my colleague Kelly is here.
Yeah, hi, I'm Kelly.
Hello, Kelly. So what I'll do is I'll just share my screen so we can start the conversation essentially. Hopefully that's available to everybody now. Essentially, one of the things that we're going to talk about is the boring bits, which is the kind of infrastructure that's important in setting up this kind of work. And then Kelly will particularly spend time talking about the development. We will talk about kind of the key things we were thinking about when we were selecting a partner. And I guess from the position of transparency to really kind of highlight our learning, because certainly for us, this is a learning experience and we would not want people to go in blind and look at what they might take from this. So I guess from the first point, it is worth saying this is different to any other digital intervention that you might, or digital platform that you might introduce. I know Kelly certainly reflected this was quite different to CCBT, for example, and the experience of implementing video conferencing, and even quite frankly some of the back-end work that we've been doing with Maiden in the past, or even with IESO. So I'm going to start off with moving through the first slide. These are kind of the key areas that we were particularly hoping to look at when we were looking at onboarding, for example, WYSA. So increasing access with the digital referral tool, essentially ensuring clients are supported, implementing an effective e-triage, and also essentially looking at the client experience, and that was quite key for us. To look at that, though, you probably need to know something about the context of the service. We work with Dorset Healthcare, so Steps to Wellbeing is a first wave service. It's digitally mature. It covers Dorset and Southampton. The savvy amongst you will know that Southampton isn't in Dorset, but we do cover that service. And that's somewhere in the region of around 37,000 referrals a year. So it just gives you a sense of the size of the service. Most of the referrals are generally online. But one of the things that we've particularly found in terms of our digital implementation is to improve patient choice and experience, to look at how we can really focus more effectively on those not only who are able to use a digital platform, but those who can't. Part of that meant, in terms of partner selection, we were looking at whether we could find a tool that worked with the system and that was bespoke to Steps, really. So in terms of the case for change, lots of diagrams, a bit busy, but essentially we know that digitization is part of the long-term plan. There was the opportunity that we all had last year around the spending review allocation, which couldn't be spent on pay or substantive roles. So this was an opportunity for us to follow on from our digital innovation group, which we developed internally about our aspirations. And particularly, one of the things I'd say is, if you're thinking about what you're doing, it's worth looking at what kind of competitive advantage do you have within your organizations so that you can undertake this. One of the things that was really important for us is our synergies with IM&T, so Information Management and Technology team, and how that linked in well with us so that we could essentially develop these roles. I'll skip over a little bit around value chain. It's a bit boring. But what I would say is, in terms of the way that we analysed it, is we looked at, you can use McKinsey 7S, which is certainly an approach we might use in our organisation. We had a sync in terms of our strategies. The structures were able to support us in undertaking this work. Some bits needed adapting, which I'm sure Kelly can elaborate on a little bit, perhaps even in the Q&A. But we also had systems in place. So I know Ross previously mentioned IAPT and the link that is available there via Prism. And also in terms of the staff being sufficiently matured to have that operational and clinical perspective, and having a strong ops team is quite key. We have a collaborative style, and also we had the ability to de-silo and interface with stakeholders. So let's just kind of think about partner selection, which is the other thing I'm going to spend a bit of time focusing upon. And the key thing to pay attention to is about being business-minded. Where we don't tend to do that within the NHS. We tend to kind of focus upon how we are public service organisations. But certainly with the changes in terms of the ICS and us all becoming interdependent, meant that we needed to look at what kind of parallels there were across organisations. So in this case, the WYSA app was certainly the most downloaded across the system, and in terms of the ORCA affiliation as well, meant that we were in a better position to gain traction with then the CCG, now the ICB, and also it was timing. So essentially we needed a trajectory that fit well with our timelines. And so as a result, we, on this occasion, have selected WYSA. There are, not the BBC, but there are obviously other providers out there, but I'm just going to highlight some of the things that were relevant to us. The ORCA rating was important in addition to safety and IG, so DTAC and the DSS DCB 1029, which does mean something. It was the top downloaded app on ORCA from 2020, and it was particularly heartened by the NIHR trials to demonstrate the evidence that sits behind the work. Of course, Ross has already mentioned the development team, which are ex-IAPT staff, so certainly understand the culture and the nature of IAPT services, but also more broadly, being able to then expand outwards across the system, because actually the WYSA app was being used by a number of different partners, certainly in the acutes, for example, which meant that certainly it fit well with the crisis pathway too. So we were particularly looking outwards. Of course, the interventions are in line with the IAPT model and NICE guidance, and it's the integration part as well, because particularly we're looking at the admin processes that were quite onerous and would slow us down in terms of how we would manage referrals into the system. I guess the other thing to add really is that the wider system was quite keen on this, and so it really helped our liaison with them when we were developing the tool. And I think it's the flexibility and responsivity that's always been quite important to us. It's one of the reasons that we've worked quite well with Maiden as a system provider when compared to, say, Serverlec or other providers within the Dorset system anyway. What I'll do is I'll just move on and hand over to Kelly.
Hi. So I'm going to try and talk a bit more about the kind of practical implementation of where we're at so far with the implementation of the AI. And I was trying to think about how to summarize 6 months of work into 10, what is now 8 minutes. And it's challenging, but I would try and get across the most important points and what I wish I'd known at the beginning of this journey. As Morad already touched on, it's quite different to previous tech implementations I've been involved in. We're quite a techie IAPT service. We've got lots of things going on. But what's been different about this has been that the way we're implementing it, it covers our whole patient pathway from referral through assessment, through waiting lists, engagement in treatment, and then to discharge. Whereas if you think about something like computerized CBT, it's for a very specific group of people within your patient population. The other thing is around the bespoke nature of it. Normally with things like computerized CBT or web forms or whatever it might be, you get a sort of a standard package. This is so bespoke, which is amazing. It has been incredible to work so collaboratively with WYSA and create something that really works for our patients, our staff, and our service. However, that does mean there's a lot more work involved from a service perspective, and I think that's really important to bear in mind. I think it's a massive advantage, but yeah, I think it's just not underestimating the amount of time involved in something like this. For me, would be a kind of key thing. The other thing is making sure your project team that you've got involved is kind of covers all of your approaches. So I provided the kind of clinical input because the majority of what we're doing is based on assessment, and I'm a PWP lead by background, but making sure you've got operational input, business support, a data person to make sure that whatever you do with WYSA or any other provider doesn't affect your data quality. So that was really important to us to maintain our data quality with whatever we do with our pathways. We were also really, really lucky, and I appreciate not all IAPT services will have this, but we've got a comms officer and a project support who were integral to kind of keeping this going. The project support officer was really helpful at kind of keeping us on track, helping with the clinical safety case, that sort of thing. So the data protection impact assessment and clinical safety case is probably where I have made the biggest learning steps. It's not something I've been involved with before, and I think we were quite naive when we went into this because, as Morad said, we chose WYSA because of the excellent kind of clinical safety ratings, WYSA, ORCA approval, DTAC approval, our ICB was on board with it, and I think we probably underestimated how much work was still required in terms of information governance and clinical safety cases. And I had to train as a clinical safety officer. There were quite a few delays, so we had to push back our implementation by about 2 months because of the clinical safety case, essentially, and getting that written. And that is a very time-consuming piece of work. So that would be my main take-home point. If you take nothing else home, is start that right at the beginning. Don't leave it 2 months down the road like we did. In terms, oh, sorry, next slide, please, Morad. Okay. So when we initially went into this, our specification was mainly around having a chatbot to aid self-referral. So we hadn't thought about the triage. That wasn't something we were looking for. We were looking mainly for the chatbot. So it was really important to us that this was an additional choice, not a replacement. So patients can still refer via normal methods of telephone. They can still use our static online referral form, and we're quite interested in looking at whether more people choose to use the chatbot to refer, or whether people choose to use the static form, and see if there's a difference in dropout rates for those two options. Things you'll need to think about is what to ask at what stage. So we'd initially thought about having a chatbot that referred people that asked for additional information than what we take normally. So things like drug and alcohol use, long-term condition support, that sort of thing, and to speed up our screening and assessment processes. When we met with WYSA, though, they obviously had feedback from work they'd done with either IAPT services, with patient user groups, that sort of thing, who suggested that actually maybe making that first form not too long, and not to ask too many intrusive questions at that early stage. So we decided to also introduce an e-triage form, which wasn't on our initial plan, which was in development with WYSA anyway. I'm getting hurried along. Sorry, guys, it's distracting. Okay, so I will ignore all of that. Risk obviously is incredibly important. Ask me in the Q&A session. E-triage. Okay, so I guess e-triage wasn't on our initial plan. When it was suggested to us, the approach we wanted to take was about reducing the amount of information and time taken in a PWP assessment for information that isn't perhaps using their clinical skills and training in the best way, so that they can focus their time on risk assessment, clinical decision making, funneling treatment options, and socialization to the CBT model. We know patients find assessments really helpful to feel heard. This will give more opportunity for that. So we have not gone into this as a way of asking PWPs to do more assessments. We're hoping that either the time won't change significantly, but it will be more valuable for patients, or that if the time reduces, then that frees up PWPs to have a little bit more time for everything else they have to do. We know how pressurized it is for PWPs to do an assessment in 35 minutes like you're trained. It's really hard. We're not going to signpost anyone out of the service, but we have lots of opportunities built in to direct people to additional support, for example, drug and alcohol support services, carer support, that sort of thing throughout the e-triage form, but we're not going to signpost anyone out because they will already have an assessment booked at that point. One thing to think about is stop messaging me and tell me how you want it to look in IAPT, PCMIS, whatever it is you use. Think about before, speak to your PWPs, clinicians, whoever's using the information, about how they want that to look and make it the most user-friendly. There's no point gathering all this information if it's not going to be usable for them once we get to that point. Next slide, please. I'd gone into this saying I'm going to talk really slow, and I'm sorry I've had to speed up so much. So the last phase of our project is a therapist companion tool, which is going to give everyone access to the premium WYSA app. It's going to be really bespoke to our service with specific resources, editable worksheets. We all know how clunky it can be to work online with someone with a thought diary, so this will hopefully make it a lot better. We're going to have a user communication channel between patients and clinicians. We've done some clinician focus groups already about what they want from it, and we hope to do some peer and patient focus groups. Next slide, please. The transitions are really slow, so I'm just going to start talking. Okay, so essentially main things from us are, it's not the same as previous tech we've implemented. Be really realistic with your time and your planning. Prepare as much as you can ahead of the game in terms of your processes and pathways and what you think you might want it to look like, what potential blockers there might be in your current pathways and processes that might make implementing AI challenging. Get your clinical safety case and DPIA done as soon as possible. Have a great project team around you to help out, and get patients and clinicians involved at early stages.
That was fantastic.
I'm sorry, I had to speak so fast at the end there.
No, that was brilliant. Both of you, thank you so much for that overview. It was really rich, and there was a lot that was packed in there. So that was brilliant. I hope it's given the audience some food for thought. Please do post some questions to us in the chat, either directly or indirectly. Or if you are feeling so bold, you can also raise a direct question, I think. But I'm going to start off with the first question that's come through. And it's, how will you evaluate the impact of the AI on the patients or the staff experience?
That's something we're starting to look at the moment. So there's lots of different measurables we're looking at. So one of the big ones is going to be around time taken for an assessment with patients that have used the chatbot e-triage versus those that haven't. So that's one thing we're going to look at. Also, really important to gather qualitative data about that, because like I said, for us, it's not just about speeding things up or being more efficient. It's about what is that experience like for the patients and the assessors. So that's quite a big one for us. I think I'm just trying to remember off the top of my head, my brain's gone to fuzz now. I'm just getting up the measurables sheet, but at the early stages of the work with you guys, we looked at the different phases and thought about what our outcomes were and what measurables we wanted to have in there. And you know, user experience, user feedback is something we haven't quite decided yet. I don't think whether we're going to build in user feedback into the chatbots, because that's an option, whether we're going to send out separate forms or whether we're going to incorporate some way in our normal patient experience feedback. But that's going to be really important for us, and that's kind of the next stage along. Morad, is anything from your perspective?
No, I mean, the only other part is, and I don't think we've really kind of emphasized it, is around, obviously there's the evaluation of the efficacy of the chatbot itself and those people who do use it, but also what that then means for the way that we organize the rest of our service. So in terms of the inequalities, those people who won't use the chatbot, and therefore the consequent experience. So, you know, it doesn't happen in isolation. And so therefore we would be looking more broadly at what is the experience of the service now that we've kind of reorganized it compared to previously.
Thank you. What has the therapist response been to the introduction of AI in the services?
So it is worth saying that with any sort of technology that's introduced, there is often a level of concern or skepticism. I mean, we all know that one of the first AIs was literally a counsellor that reflected statements back, and in terms of addressing that kind of skepticism, it's about actually what kind of portion does this role fill. It's not necessarily a replacement in of itself. It's about us maximizing the value. So maximizing that key bit that we know that's really important. You know, the diagram that I skipped, which was essentially that interaction between the client and the clinician. So being able to essentially engage and have conversations about this is what's really important, and it's a continuing dialogue. The other thing to also add is, whilst there is some skepticism, a lot of people are also interested, but it's worth saying that it's partly because it's on the back of all the other stuff that we've perhaps done in the past. So this is part of a continuing cultural shift, and you are also in an audience that is often more likely to want to work with this type of approach because it's IAPT and it attracts a particular type of clinical perspective anyway.
Can I just quickly say, at the beginning of the year, we were doing, our PWP leads were doing a quality improvement project looking at how to reduce the amount of time taken in assessments. So I think this came along at a perfect time as well in terms of therapists are actually asking for this. You know, that more and more content is being asked of people in their sessions. So I think the feedback has generally been, or the reception's generally been a bit more positive than skeptical, although there is, of course, that element to it as well.
Thank you. We've got, if there was one point of learning that you would take from this journey, what would it be?
I'll let you answer that, Kelly.
I mean, it's the really boring one, but it is the DPIA and the clinical safety case, because that's caused us so many problems by not getting that done sooner or later. Even down to, I only attended my clinical safety training last week because you have to wait so long to get on it nationally. So get yourself booked on if you need to. Just the kind of practical side of things, I think for me, that's a boring one, I'm sorry.
Yeah, and actually, I think one of the questions that we get asked a lot is around what kind of happens on the NHS trust side. What work needs to happen before we can get to the point where we're actually looking at care pathways and looking at solutions in terms of information governance and cybersecurity. Can you talk a little bit about that?
A lot. So yeah, I think that's I think that was the side of things. I think it's speaking to your information governance officer at the earliest possible opportunity, kind of, you know, linking them in. You know, you guys have linked in with our IG lead, which has been great, but linking them in at the earliest opportunity. Like I said, planning of clinical safety, who's gonna do it, who's got the training appropriate to sign off. That has to go through a medical director in our trust, but that might be different in different trusts. Morad, do you know anything more from your side of things?
Yeah, so obviously with the development of CNIOs and chief CMIOs, so essentially the way that trusts have shifted in more recent times, it's more likely that they would come into play. We'd only recently recruited them, so hence it was going through our medical director at this stage, rather than a chief nursing or medical information officer. So yeah, the routes might be different, slightly different across each of the trusts.
There's a question that's come in from Julie Tran Graham, and it's kind of aimed towards WYSA, but you can probably tell us in your own words as well how this works. So you've got a referral that's come in, and it's kind of not an IAPT referral. What happens then?
There are big flowcharts available that sit behind all the decision-making processes that Kelly loves.
Yeah, so that was the bit I didn't have time to talk about. I think there's lots of kind of information on the website saying, please, you know, this is what IAPT does. Please do not use this form if you feel that you're in crisis or you need any urgent help, you're suicidal. Then throughout the pathway, the AI is clever enough to pick up if someone uses keywords such as suicide or self-harm. And again, it will kind of take users back round to that, so, you know, crisis information. And we're lucky in Dorset that we have a trust-wide crisis service that it takes people through to. So it's about redirecting people to the appropriate support.
And I guess one of the things to note, and you've probably picked up on it, Julie, I note from the conversation, is that this is with one eye onto the primary and secondary care transformation agenda, so the community mental health agenda, and essentially how all of this will integrate together so that there is no wrong door, that there is a seamless transition. So essentially we would see this as expanding, and it's one of the reasons that we're needing that level of adaptability. So we are able to essentially connect bits of the system together without somebody needing to know how the system already looks.
Awesome. Okay. Thank you very much, Morad and Kelly. Thank you for your time in preparing that presentation. And we're going to have an interactive discussion. So this is the time for everyone to be moved into the various separate rooms. cameras on, microphones on. There'll be somebody either from WYSA or the presentation team today to help facilitate discussions. But what we're going to do is we're going to open up the floor with these questions, which will also be in the chat. So when you go into the various rooms, you'll still be able to see the questions that are on the screen to kind of stimulate some of the debate around how do we actually take an AI digital tool, embed it safely, securely into IAPT services so it increases the quality of care for patients, makes the therapist's jobs easier, but how do we do it well? So we've got some feedback from various rooms. Lilla is next to me. So Lilla, do you want to give us some feedback from your rooms?
So in our room, we only got through questions 1 and 2 because I was bad at timekeeping. But for question 1, we were talking about kind of risks and how AI would help in managing risk or in picking up risk, and how the triage tool works. And we also talked about in the second question, kind of about what the problems are and how you would go about doing a partner selection. I think Morad kind of explained really well about thinking about what it is what the problem is in the first place, to be able to select what products you actually or what you would want to procure, and thinking quite carefully about what your service needs are before you go out and scope. It's a key question to ask. And we talked about internal kind of processes, also about making sure that you have an organizational chart and you know who's who to contact, etc., etc. But so they're the main kind of themes that we spoke about.
Lovely. Thank you, Lilla. Next in my line is Nikki Main.
Hi, yes. So we had a couple of discussions. One was around kind of where to start if you're new to this, if you're not sure where to go. So where you might want to go internally in terms of maybe to your CCIO or IT or your R&D teams, or where you might like to go or might like to learn more externally in terms of websites, that might help you to learn a bit more about the processes and standards that are important when you're considering adding a digital innovation to your service. The other area that we looked at was around how digital processes might enhance or add to or change the current IAPT offers, but also whilst remaining IAPT compliant. So we talked a little bit about medical device licensing and the importance of any digital company that you look at procuring, making sure that the device licensing is where it needs to be, and also I think around what AI can add to. So we spoke a bit about, what does a digital innovation just kind of make something look pretty or make something look nice? What does it add on top of that? So we spoke a bit about picking up risk. We spoke a bit about how they might be able to help with containing and supporting somebody's mental health whilst they're on a waiting list for as long as we have got waiting lists and can't move entirely across to a digital solution, which I don't think is what anyone thinks will happen exclusively. But so that's kind of a summary of where we were at.
Awesome, cool. Sounds like quite a rich debate. Thank you, Nikki.
Yeah, we kind of ran out of time, but hey.
Yeah. John, over to you.
Thanks, Ross. So the first bit on kind of safety and where to go was fairly quick for us. So we gave out the guidance for the IAPT digital standards and had to talk about the DTAC web guidance, and similar to other conversations about where to go within the organisation to look for support in implementing. We were really lucky to have a Dorset in the room as well, just to share some further views on starting that process early early, and why that's really important in lining everybody up. When we got onto the next bit about bits of the sort of patient pathway that could be supported by digital, it was we actually strayed into a conversation about efficacy, as opposed to the kind of opportunity, which does lead us in nicely a little bit to the case study that we're going to hear about a little bit later. But it was a broad, not just about WYSA. We spoke about broadly, you know, what is the kind of body of research of impact of any kind of digital front door on patients and clinicians, and we talked a little bit through how we're using at WYSA the randomized control trials to really get under the skin of that from a clinical perspective.
Awesome. Thank you very much, John. And last but not least, we have Alina.
So I was actually in the room with Nikki May. So yeah, so we kind of just strayed into kind of how AI would fit into the pathway, and whether maybe even in the future it would change kind of the pathway.
Okay, cool. You're not allowed to steal your own thunder, so you can't tell us any more about your experiences because you're about to tell us about them. In our room, we talked a little bit about the safety standards and the DPIA. It was interesting to note some people were aware of the DPIA process, but not many people were aware of the DTAC, and so excuse me, we discussed a little bit around what the DTAC is, what it contains, and we'd also in the welcome and introduction had a discussion specifically around the DTAC, and actually talked about the fact that talking therapies is probably not really fit for purpose. It doesn't really fit what we need to make sure that digital talking therapy apps, tools are safe. And the good news on that is there's been a conversation with formerly NHSX, now NHS England, around an additional set of standards that are amended or appended to the DTAC, which are specifically around digital talking therapies, and those well, they've been due to be published for a while, but they will, we promise they will be published by NHSE as part of the edition, so that we know that when we procure digital therapeutic tools, that they're as safe as they can be to a really high standard.
Ross, Rachel's actually here if Rachel wants to have a word on that somewhere.
Oh yes, she is, isn't she? I'm not
Where
sure.
are you, Rachel?
That's putting Rachel on the spot.
I am very much on the spot. I've put the link to the assessment criteria work in perhaps that's only went to our chat. I'll put it in the broader chat, which hopefully will do a better job at filling everybody in than I can do. But the standards are there for everybody to look at and use locally, and hopefully we'll have. It's a project that's in its early stages, but hopefully we'll be able to take product through them centrally, so that we can provide more guidance on which products are out there that meet standards we'd expect to see for products being used in IAPT.
Awesome, thank you very much. So yeah, some more of the feedback from guidance and support was essentially when people were looking internally for guidance and support. A lot of the time people kind of felt that they had to learn on their feet, and that the teams that were supporting them were also learning about the range of digital standards, clinical safety standards, medical device licensing, that type of thing. I think where people could get to the CNIOs and the CCIOs of the organisation, there was more of an understanding, certainly more of an understanding of the kind of clinical application of the digital standards. But sometimes it was a bit tough to get to that stage. Also, sometimes it's tough when you do get to that stage, because when you start to drill into what's being purchased in terms of a digital tool, it might not meet those standards. They might inhibit some of the work that you're doing, or it might stop a process that's already been set up to kind of go back, revalidate it, make sure it's safe, and then redeploy. But obviously there was an understanding that it was important to get there. Our final case study of the day, some of you might have seen Lucy and Alina in the breakout rooms today from CNWL. They're going to talk to you about their AI waiting list intervention and how they're looking to save clinical time and improve client outcomes. So over to Lucy and Alina.
Thanks, Ross. So Alina is going to hopefully be able to share our presentation so you can all see that. I'll just wait for that to come up. There we go. Okay, so just to introduce us, first of all, so I'm Lucy Wilson-Shaw. I'm the clinical lead of the Kensington and Chelsea IAPT service, and I'll let Alina introduce herself.
Hi, I'm Alina Paik, and I'm the Assistant Psychologist and Research Assistant for the Kensington and Chelsea IAPT.
So we're going to tell you about a research trial that we've set up in our service between the service and WYSA. It's looking at how to use WYSA to help us with our waiting list. So we're going to explain a bit about why we're hosting this research trial, why we wanted to do it, how it's set up, and what we hope to learn from it. So I'm going to hand over to Alina for the first few slides.
Yeah, so just a little bit of data from a systemic review that the Centre for Mental Health did. These were kind of the percentages of people that were discharged straight after the triage, kind of waited over 6 weeks for the first treatment session, which is 38%, and then waited 4 months for the first treatment session, which was 22%. This data was from the 2019-2020 year, and we kind of just saw that after COVID, every mental health service basically just got a bit more pressure, and these numbers probably have doubled, or if not tripled, in the last 2 or 3 years. And with kind of staff retaining the same amount, so there's not a lot of more staff being recruited, kind of the level of leaving the services and coming on, it's not, the waiting lists are not obviously getting better, and more people that are suffering with kind of all of these conditions, as you may know, and senior IAPT services, that they are coming to IAPT for help. So yeah, and what we hope to demonstrate with this RCT, so it is the first ever RCT conducted in the NHS, and it is exploring the role of an AI chatbot in the mental health care pathway. So we're exploring multiple factors to enable us to better understand how continuous conversational support affects outcomes. So exploring how it affects the MDS scores, so the PHQ-9, the GAD-7s, also the user's reported experience, and you can monitor that through kind of patient experience questionnaires, or what we're doing in the trial is we're doing a 12-week review after every with every patient after 12 weeks of them using the AI, and obviously the service and economic implications of this support, so whether it will cost you less as a service to embed this or more, or kind of how that will all end up in the last little bit. And then what we are testing, so the test group participants will gain access to the app straight away. So I should start that by saying we have 2 groups. One we will have is the control group, and one as the test group. It get kind of the boring stuff with the randomized software, kind of putting everyone, we don't get to decide who goes into what group. And the test group participants will get the app straight away after giving their consent to the app. They will have access to the app for about a year after, and after the 12 weeks have finished, they will go through a qualitative review with myself, as I'm the one that's kind of conducting this all throughout the service. And then obviously everything gets along with the quantitative kind of PHQ-9 measures that we are gathering from the app once a week, and the clinical contacts that will come into IAPT that kind of all gets all the data gets tested basically, and the control group participants will get the app after the 12 weeks review question, so they will not have access to the app for the first 12 weeks, and that is just so that we can obviously check at the same time for groups of participants, and yeah, and then they will again get it for 12 months after they download the app. So this is just a little bit of what, let me go back, of what the app looks like. And then this is what it will look like in IAPT. So it will, I'm sure everybody knows what IAPT looks like, but there's a clinical contact, and one after the 12 weeks and or when they get booked into treatment, the patient's summary of everything that they did, kind of modules that they've accessed, any support that they've accessed, and their PHQ-9 and GAD-7 scores will get uploaded onto the clinical contacts. It is up to your service to kind of decide what, how you would basically choose that, whether you would have that once a week, once a month, do you want to see everything, and that's quite all flexible.
Alina, should I talk a little bit about my experience of setting that up for the service? So I think similar to the previous presentation by Morad and Kelly, it was a really collaborative process between the service and WYSA in terms of how it gets set up. So we worked with them to think about, well, how and when does it pull information through? Where does that appear? What does it look like when it appears? We've been able to set that up so that for us, we didn't want that information pulling through while people were on the waiting list. We only wanted to trigger it once they actually started treatment. So that's kind of how we've set it up. It's also very individualized to the service, how you set it up with the kind of emergency contact safety plan, SOS incidents that are coming in. So we were able to give the information for our area that we would standardly use with people about which services to direct them to if they are in crisis or they need kind of more immediate help, and make sure that that's built into the version of the app that we're using. WYSA also did quite a lot of work both with our service users and with our clinicians to think with them about kind of, well, how should this app be set up with for your service? What is it useful to include? What should it look like? And Nikki Tyso kind of was very involved in that as their patient experience lead to kind of make sure that that was all set up well in a way that would work for the service. So should we go on to the next slide?
Yeah. Oh, there we go.
Okay, so one of the reasons why I really wanted to do this in our service was we all know about access targets. In IAPT, this kind of wasn't something that we struggle with too much for first appointments, but we very much struggle with our second appointment access target, especially at the moment. So I'm hoping when you look at our waiting list information on here, it doesn't fill you with horror and that you're a bit like, oh yes, that's familiar. We are finding that we are having very long waiting lists for step 3 CBT in particular. We have found that it has been very difficult to fill all our posts at that level in the service, and we are getting increasing demand for the more complex work at step 3 compared to the number of patients that can be seen purely at step 2. So there's both more people going directly to step 3 and more people needing to be stepped up from step 2 to step 3 as well. So we have known for a while we need to think about what can we do to help people while they're on the waiting list, because they are going to be sitting there for a while, and we know that when people are on waiting lists and they're not getting anything, there often is the chance that they will get worse, and also it kind of decreases engagement levels when they do eventually get offered treatment. But we also need to find a way of doing that that doesn't further use clinical time, because if we put clinician time into it, then in effect the waiting list just get longer because they're not able to pick up as many people from the waiting list because they're spending their time doing check-in calls with people or review appointments that aren't really the start of treatment. So that's kind of some of the reasons why I was like, yes, we want to do this with you. So we'll go into the next slide, Lena.
Yeah, sorry, it's just taking a little bit of a while to change. Oh. There we go. And yeah, we was hoping to have some actual data to share with you guys, but a little hiccup, so we haven't started the trial just yet. However, this is actually some data pulled from WYSA, and they've basically found that those who engaged with the app showed higher reduction in depression symptoms, so a reduction of 31%, and as compared to those who didn't engage or engaged less with WYSA, a reduction of 18% in the pre-scores. And yeah, just to reiterate Lucy's point, that with patient scores kind of decreasing, we can reduce clinical time, reduce intensity of treatment, and therefore kind of move on to maybe economic things like keeping staff retention. So maybe staff won't be too overburdened with work and clinical work, how they are, and kind of retain staff that way. And Lucy, yeah, do you want to?
Yeah, so this just, I was really keen when I was approached about this, that yes, this sounds great, but only if it doesn't involve clinicians having to put a lot of time in something, because they really need to focus on seeing the patients, whether that's one-to-one appointments or groups, and kind of delivering the treatment. So it needs to be something that works for the service. So some of you will use IAPT in your services, some of you won't. So this won't necessarily be familiar to everyone. But on IAPT, if you can set up a digital provider that connects into IAPT, which is your clinical notes system, and then it's very simple to kind of refer people on. So there's just a little drop-down menu where you can select refer to provider, select the provider that you want to send the person to. And in this case, the way that we've got it set up is that will then ping out this SMS message to people with a link and a code. They simply follow that link through, put the code in, they're into the app, it will talk them through the setup, and then they're there and they're going and they're using it. WYSA is then, it individualizes itself to them, it gets to know them through the chatbot. It's set up individually to the service with our particular information. We're not, the sort of way we've set it up is we're not using that as a monitoring tool for us during that time. It's very much about helping them get going with a CBT approach to their problem, get going with learning some tools and coping strategies. It's a way, if they're having an emergency, they can use the SOS to remind themselves of the safety plan that's already been set up for them at triage and which organisations they can go to. But none of that is coming through to the service while they're on the waiting list. But when they do come into the service, it will give us a little summary of what kinds of tools they were interacting with. It will give us the latest MDS scores from their last contact with it. So it will give us a little bit of an update. And then it's kind of very much up to the clinician. Do they continue to utilize that within the treatment that they're delivering and kind of build it in to the treatment that they're delivering? Or actually does the patient just continue to use it as something on the side and it's not what they focus on in the treatment? That's something for the patient and the clinician to decide together. There we go. The next slide. So I guess we're sort of hoping in this that it might help improve our recovery rates. This isn't the primary need for us. We're not struggling with our recovery rates at the moment, but it's always nicer to feel like you're doing better for your patients and helping more of them improve. By kind of getting people started with something straight away, by getting them on that road to recovery, we're hoping that it does improve recovery. The risk I think I've already covered, so I'm not going to talk about that again here. I guess our main hope is that kind of it engages people more, so we're not kind of losing people because of our long waiting list, that they're already getting engaged and they're coming in prepared for the therapy. I think we would also hope that it will mean that perhaps they will need less therapy sessions overall within the service because they've already got going, they're motivated, they've kind of, you know, got their head around what the CBT approach is like, what it's like to kind of practice using tools and use them to help yourself, so that they're really coming in that mindset of readiness for therapy rather than the first few sessions needing to be spent on that.
Yeah, and then just to talk a little bit about how it actually works within IAPT, within the care pathway for us at the moment, and obviously how it will look like in the future. So the same referral process kind of as normal stays, whether they get referred by a GP, external organisation, or they self-refer themselves. They come through, everything is screened and kind of details double checked. They go through their triage. yeah, they kind of get asked for consent and just double check that that everything is in order. And then how it's done as a trial at the moment, I would be basically, or a psychology assistant in any other case, would screen through everyone that is kind of eligible for the study. So at the moment we've got a few eligibility criteria. Obviously, kind of they have to speak and read basic English, just because it's not available in other languages just yet. And then kind of a few PHQ-9, I think can't be above 15, just because we would have to have a clinician involved with that. So we are just looking for those people at the moment who would be eligible, and then I would contact them with some materials. Once they consent to the study, an algorithm randomization happens, and then they go into the treatment or the control group. And if they're in the control group, they kind of just remain on the same care pathway, waiting for their first treatment to be booked in. Obviously, that could be different for everybody on different steps and with different availability for everyone. So after the 12 weeks, whether they're in treatment or not, we'll do that review process with them and then offer them the app. And if they got put into the treatment group straight away, they would get access to the app straight away. And again, that doesn't impact on how quickly they get booked into their treatment. It doesn't fast pace them or anything. It's just that they would have the use of the app straight away for 12 weeks, and well, for 12 months from the very beginning. But after the 12 weeks, the kind of interview happens, the 12-week review, what we call it, and kind of a lot of qualitative feedback is gathered. And then they would carry on with the standard IAPT pathway. Whether they use the app or not, it's completely up to them. Whether clinicians use the app to kind of, well, their summary of what the patients have done in the app within their sessions, that again is all up to them. And the clinicians will just be able to see what has been accessed and kind of the latest PHQ-9 and GAD-7 scores.
Okay, so I know this is an RCT, this hasn't been tried before, so what we're hoping is that this really will generate some useful information and answer those questions about, does offering this to people in an AI app that we hope is more engaging people for, there's something like Silver Cloud. Silver Cloud is something we use in our service already. We don't have a great success with engaging people with it. We don't have great uptake, even though we continue to offer it. So my hope is that this is something that, because it has that AI chatbot element, that it individualizes itself to the person more, that it's something that people are more able to engage with, that it improves their experience of the service and of the treatment, that it will hopefully reduce the need for the number of sessions that are offered. So therefore is really useful for us in terms of efficiency of use of our resources within the service. And most importantly, that it's not adding any extra burdens on for our clinicians. It's very easy to use. It's not extra time for them. It's something that should make their jobs easier, if anything, not kind of cause any additional work for them. I think that might be the end of our presentation.
Just in time.
Within time. I didn't even get any time warnings.
Wowee, brilliant. Thank you so much for giving us that whistle-stop tour of, I know there's been a lot of work that's gone into the RCT in CNWL, so trying to condense it all into 20 minutes is going to be absolutely impossible, but you did a fantastic job. We've got a few questions that have come up whilst you've been talking. Those from John Newland. We've got thanks for sharing the information. Is it possible to see it by age at all?
Yeah, I think obviously we would be able to pull anything from kind of IAPT and MDS scores that way, and I'm sure that kind of the investigators behind the trial are looking at different kind of subcategories of who it affects more and less, and who's more engaged and stuff like that. So yeah, definitely probably will be, and is a question that is being considered.
Awesome. And we've also got from John, good to know that people will be excluded if their scores are higher referral. What happens if their scores go higher after referral?
Yeah, so just like kind of them being on the waiting list waiting for the first treatment, they are not monitored by the service. They're not kind of allocated to any therapist. They get given a safety plan, they get given the numbers and kind of reassurance to keep themselves safe. Again, IAPT is not an emergency service, so kind of the whole direction of accessing GP, A&E and other emergency services, they would kind of get directed to. We won't see their scores until they get booked into a treatment and actually are allocated to a therapist and therefore kind of have contact with a therapist. So we won't be able to see if those scores are high. And again, WYSA will continue to remind to use the SOS button, and it already knows, even without the scores being high, to kind of pick up on certain words that that could mean kind of somebody is at risk to themselves and others.
Yeah. So I guess in effect, the same process that you have for patients without WYSA being embedded is replicated on the digital pathway, but what you've got is the addition of kind of that two-way discussion with the AI chatbot. So when people want to reach out or when people need extra support because they're above a clinical threshold, the answers are there at their fingertips because they're already having a conversation.
Yeah, and WYSA actually lets you call straight from the phone because it's right on your phone on the app. You can kind of press the button and take you straight there.
And John's made the comment that there might be dropouts for the trial, but those patients are essentially getting a kind of a digital answer to the same process that they would have gone through without that same care pathway. So it's just
we didn't want to change anything about our care pathway. We didn't want to change anything about our approach to waiting lists or start saying, oh, if people are getting worse, they can get in touch with us and have an extra appointment, because then in effect that's going to make our waiting list for treatment longer because we're going to have to keep kind of reassessing people. So it's very much, we were trying to use this as, let's see if this is something that's more effective and more engaging for people than giving them a self-help booklet while they're on the waiting list, or recommending another app from the Orca app library that doesn't have that's maybe free to access and doesn't have an AI element to it, and see if this is something that would work better and be more effective for them whilst on the waiting list.
Brilliant. Thank you both. And John says thanks in the chat as well. So if there's any other questions, please drop them into the chat. We've got one for you, which is, what are the eligibility criteria for the study, and whether it will stay the same if this is established as a standard practice?
I'm going to let Alina answer the eligibility for the study question.
Yeah, so definitely the eligibility, again, like I said, they have to kind of be able to talk and read basic English, just as it's not available just yet, but obviously WYSA working really hard to get that out in a lot of languages. And the PHQ-9 and the GAD-7s actually can't be above 15, as that would let them, kind of have to ensure that a clinician is in contact with the patient. I think that would stay the same for now, obviously, until kind of we know a bit more about how the app will affect and how it can help people and everything. And then I'm sure some laws could be changed in the future, but yeah, and nothing else kind of really that stands out, just that they are eligible for an IAPT treatment, so that they've basically been accepted to have IAPT treatment within a service.
Yeah, I guess something I'd say is that I would hope that sense of there being a like complete cut off on the PHQ and GAD scores is something that would be reviewed, and that there could be a gathering of evidence about that. Like cut-offs like that are always a little bit arbitrary. Is someone who scored 16 on there really not able to benefit from this, and not safe with it, whereas someone who scored 15 is? We all know that those scores aren't necessarily any reflection of people's risk or even complexity sometimes. So as a clinical lead, I would hope that that is something that would be looked into, but obviously we will use it as the evidence indicates and as it is advised or recommended to be used, because that's what we should be doing in the service. But my hope would be that in the future that is something that would be looked into, would potentially change. Because from our perspective as an IAPT service, if we're accepting someone into the service and we're putting them on a waiting list and we've made a safety plan, in our view, they are safe enough to be on that waiting list. And if we didn't think that, we wouldn't be taking them into our service, we would be directing them somewhere else.
Yeah, that makes sense. Thank you. We've got a couple of questions coming in from the audience. We've got Gail's asked about the costs of both of the projects. The cost of the RCT, Gail, is going to be very different to the cost that the NHS is charged in terms of working with WYSA. So the RCT is a huge bid that went into NIHR, and it supports both academic facilities, WYSA, CNWL, to kind of make the RCT work. Excuse me. WYSA have applied to go onto a framework in London where we'll be able to sell WYSA to NHS IAPT services. We're not at liberty to discuss whether we've got onto that framework yet, but if we do, the pricing will be all there in terms of what it costs to use WYSA, and that should also help local services in terms of their the standards and procurement and stuff like that. So you won't have to go through DTAC and clinical safety and all of that with us, because we'll be on a framework. The cost will be clear, and you'll be able to purchase WYSA from there. Beth asked a question around the PHQ-9s and the cut-offs, and if it's specific to a service or it's a nationwide kind of cut-off or threshold. The way WYSA works is we work with a local service. So we will look at your care pathways, we will support you to make sure you're kind of fitting within nice evidence-based therapies, and that we're hopefully making additions and changes that enhances that experience for both the staff and the patients coming into the service. But what we actually do is different services have different entry criteria, different thresholds, different needs, different signposting. And so we will look to replicate that for the local service, as I say, as long as it's within kind of nice guidance. You've also got a question wondering how to apply the exclusion criteria given opt-in happens pre-assessment. Does everyone get a call on referral to check the MDS, language ability, etc., or is this always included in the referral information? And are you looking at whether online self-referrals are more likely to opt in to the study?
So just to say, this isn't happening before they have the assessment. So the referral process happens as usual. So people self-refer, or their GP refers them, screened by a clinician on our end for suitability. They get booked into their triage appointment. They have their triage appointment, which is in our service usually a 45-minute telephone appointment, either with a PWP or a step 3 worker, mostly with a PWP. If from that triage appointment, the outcome is that they are going to be offered an intervention in our service, that's the point at which they are assessed for suitability for the RCT and assigned to either the treatment group or the control group. So we already know all that information that's already been gathered. And that's what Alina will be looking at to find the people who are eligible for the trial.
Awesome. I was getting really carried away then, and I was about to ask you tons of other questions, but we've reached the end of today's session. I just wanted to say thank you ever so much. Thank you to our presenters and our earlier presenters for helping us go through that fantastic session. Our details will be available so people can contact us afterwards.